Yeah, so I had the idea for this business venture in April 2019, and I was staying at St Bino's, which is a spirituality and retreat centre in North Wales. And one afternoon I put on my walking boots and I went in search of St Bino's well, and I have some pictures, so I will show you the pictures. That's not that one. So that's St Bino's well for you to have a look at. That's what I went in search of. And I found it in the garden of someone's house. They very kindly let me in and made me a cup of tea and started to tell me the stories of how significant this sacred site was to their lives. And it reminded me of a pilgrimage that I'd been on. It was actually in 2014, which seems a whole lifetime ago. And it was to Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And we went in search of the Celtic saints. We visited Glendalough to find out about lover and protector of nature, St Kevin, the site of the 1,000-year sacred flame of St Bridget of Kildare, and even flew to the island of Inishmore, where 7 churches were established as the monastic community of St Brecon just kept growing. I'm just going to admit some more people. Okay, I'll go back to the share screen. And what I found particularly profound about this trip to Ireland were the moments of reflection and ritual that were weaved into our visits. When commemorating the life and example of Bridget, there was an opportunity for the men to acknowledge the damage done by patriarchy and honour the ministry of women in an act of reconciliation. In the ruins of St Enda's community, who was a bitter rival of Brecon on Inishmore, we were invited to be anointed with oil for healing, and at Brendan's well were sprinkled with water to symbolise cleansing and renewal. It was hugely spiritually significant for me, and I think it was as a consequence of that combination of visiting ancient sacred sites embedded in the landscape, as well as drawing on that indigenous wisdom that can inspire and resource contemporary life. Because of the difference this has made to my life, I now want to make these experiences accessible to others and create opportunities for spiritual encounter in a variety of locations with similar rich spiritual heritage. So I'm starting in Ireland, but further north in the pilgrimage I went on. So walking in the footsteps of Columba begins at pre-Christian standing stones and ends at the beach where Columba was forced to flee in exile from his homeland. And I'd like to show you the website for the new venture. So I'm just gonna admit some more people. Oops, wrong thing. It's trouble with all these different options. So here's the website. I hope you can all see that. So this is where you can find out about the first pilgrimage, which is from the 1st to the 4th of September. And this is the accommodation, and it charts where we're going to be visiting. And there's a full itinerary for people to have a look at. And I can announce tonight that the price, so it's a long weekend, so we start on a Friday lunchtime and finish on a Monday lunchtime, and the cost is £390, but there is an early bird discount of £350 if you book before the 1st of May. So do explore the website when you get the opportunity. So I'd now like to hand over to Nick, and very glad that he's with us. And he's a researcher and writer specialising in Celtic outdoor and nature spirituality. His first major book, Britain's Pilgrim Places, was made into a BBC television series called Pagans and Pilgrims in 2013, after which he completed a PhD thesis on Celtic nature spirituality. This was published as The Naked Hermit in 2019, and I've got a copy of that here, and I'd thoroughly recommend it. And some of the rituals that Nick outlines in this book are what I hope to include in the pilgrimages that I offer. And since then, he has written the best-selling guide to Britain's Pilgrim Places with Guy Hayward of the British Pilgrimage Trust, and a compilation of outdoor worship materials called Landscape Liturgies, subtitled Resources to Celebrate and Bless the Earth. So that sounds like a fantastic resource. He's currently working as Deputy Head of Southlands College at Roehampton University, London. So I'm going to hand over to Nick, and what I'll do is I'll spotlight you. I don't quite know, how do I do that? Spotlight for everyone. There we go.
I think I just start talking, it might do that automatically, might flag me up. I'm definitely unmuted, I think, so hopefully everyone can hear me. And yes, I'm Nick, and I am absolutely 100% here for Andrea tonight. When I sat down with her and we talked about it, that introduction to me makes me sound like a complete holy places nerd, which I suppose I am. And I was delighted to find a fellow traveller in Andrew who's much less of a nerd than I am, and much more of a passionate believer, and someone who's bringing it all to life with this brilliant new project. So Andrew and I are very much fellow travellers on this journey, and I'm really, really honoured to be here to help with the launch and to talk about some of the things I've seen. We are here contemplating pilgrimage, and I trust everyone here, as they enter their Lenten devotions in their second week, are all in suitably devout mood as we prepare ourselves for that long, arduous, taxing, spiritually demanding journey ahead. And I'm referring, of course, to the next 45 minutes as we talk about pilgrimage, walk some of those paths together. And I've looked at a lot of what Andrew's doing, and there's a lot of overlap. And this is a growing area. I was asked recently by the British Pilgrimage Trust, who I work with, to develop some pilgrimages which bring you out into nature and have more of a kind of ritual interaction with the landscape. And I'm just too busy at the moment with a full-time job. And then within a week or so of that, I met Andrea, who's doing much the same thing. So we're making some introductions and connections there. And I really do believe that this is, of all of the happy places where spirituality and religion are going, I think this is the most fertile land of all, the kind of pilgrimage, the outdoor, the nature spirituality. And one thing I would say at the very beginning is that if you look all the way through Christian history, the place where any religion and any belief system in Christian history has been most invigorated by outdoor spirituality. And we're looking at really from John the Baptist going out to the wilds by the River Jordan. You've got the desert monastic spirituality again going out, and then a lot of Reformed traditions later on in the Reformation. People again were going away. You need to only think of people like the Quakers or the Wesley brothers, who are preaching, born in the open air, as they say, and that's very much true of a lot of renewal movements. And I firmly believe, looking at what's happening with people's beliefs and faith now, that we will see a more healthy and happy connection with spiritual tradition and so on by reinvigorating and reinventing, rediscovering all these places. So with that in mind, as I say, I'm a real follower and fan of Andrew already. And we sat and we put the world to rights, didn't we, in the coffee shop at Roehampton University. So let me take you on a journey, and I will start showing my screen. We will start a virtual pilgrimage tonight. And this here is Loch Maree in Scotland, about halfway up Scotland. And it's a very beautiful place. And in the middle of that loch, there is a very special island. There's about 70 islands on the loch, but one is very special indeed. And I went there last summer, actually summer 2021, a year and a half ago, in an inflatable kayak, which I bought on Amazon. And I wanted to go and see this one special pilgrim island on this lake, on this loch. And as I rowed across, it's about 1.5 miles you have to row away from the nearest landing point. I realized my kayak that I bought very cheaply was leaking. So I kind of had to hug the shore. That's it, reinflated there. So I kind of hugged the shore of the islands, and it was quite a damp day with rain coming down and so on. So I made it across like a good Celtic pilgrim. Not the most holy of language, halfway across really, when it all started going wrong. But I got there to this really special island, and I pulled up my boat on the shingle to take a look around this tiny little enclave of outdoor spirituality. And this island in the middle was in past times very, very famous indeed. A lot of people would visit it, including Queen Victoria herself was rowed out in her own leaking inflatable kayak from Amazon 150 years ago. So I got there to this island, and I walked around and looked at it. This island, if you're looking at what we might call sacred places in the landscape, ticks an awful lot of boxes. It is, of course, an island, and holy islands are a big part of the British landscape. We've got them all over the place. It has also a holy well, now dried up, in the middle of it, and a sacred tree alongside. And the waters of the loch are said to cure madness. So I did go in for a quick dip while I was there. So the results of that are yet to be determined. I think the jury's out on that. And so in the middle of the island, there's a cemetery where people have been buried for at least probably around 1400, 1500 years. There's some very, very old graves, and then some fairly modern ones. Villagers nearby would vie and would determine to be buried on this island. Long way, as I say, you'd have to row a coffin 1.5 miles at least to bury people. People want to be buried in this island. And it's named Isle Maree and Loch Maree after an early Celtic missionary who was following in Columbus' footsteps, who used this island as his retreat place, and it became known as very holy. He was based at a monastery in Applecross, if you know, you're near the Isle of Skye, just on the mainland facing the top of the Isle of Skye. He was there, and it's a very sacred place, and it was treasured for a long time. And in the on one shore, there is a tree which for centuries people would come and put coins into the tree, which sounds like kind of nature devotion, except copper unfortunately poisons and kills trees. So slight flaw in that bit of nature spirituality. But there are coins wedged into this tree for hundreds of years, and there's a collection. There are piles of them everywhere, all around this tree. There's like loads and loads of coins dotted about for a very long time. And legend says, one tradition, landscape law, very important, says you shall not take anything from this island, not even a twig, not even a blade of grass, not a pebble from the beach. This island is not to have anything removed from it. And that clearly works well when it comes to a collection of coins, some of which are probably quite old. So that today is intact. And so I wandered around this very strange island, and you can see the marks of long, devotion. There's a long history has left these coins there. Most of them are kind of worn away. You can't read them, but some are definitely 19th century. Maybe Queen Victoria left one. So that was my pilgrim journey that I went on, that trip. And it might sound it's definitely unusual, and it's a bit of an adventure, and it was exciting and so on. But for me, it was a journey on several other levels. For me, there is, walking very much alongside Andrea here, a desire to rediscover and to reconnect to some of this lost heritage and some of these old traditions and practices that have decorated and created stories, narratives across the landscape that allows you to engage. That Christian reverence for the natural world in all of its mystery and all of its kind of craziness, even, and all of its randomness there, all of this kind of bizarre stuff, coming alive. And being on this island, there's like some white-tailed sea eagles over on the far cliffs, and nobody else was on the loch. I was just there in this kind of misty day, walking around this place of such ancient retreat. So it's wonderful for me. And there's another reason why, it's great to go there and kind of feel reconnected to the past. But there's another reason why this island really merits another look at what it represents. Because one thing you note when you get there is it is absolutely full of different species of trees. I don't know if there's anybody here who's kind of a real naturalist, but if they are, you'll spot that is a very ancient woodland, because there's lots of different types of tree there. There's oak, sweet chestnut, bird cherry, larch. I'm reading this out, by the way. I'm not going to identify these trees. Larch, rowan, and holly, all jostling alongside each other. And it's the only island on this loch, with about 70 other islands on it, which has its native rainforest intact. All of the others were stripped bare, and the oak trees and native forest taken away and used for iron smelting in the 19th century. And this is the only one, because of its sacred status, you shall take not even a twig from its shores, that was left alone. It was left untouched. And it is now, today, a very precious relic of really post-Ice Age rainforest. This is what it looks like. It wasn't touched. It wasn't destroyed. So the holiness of the island, it was great for me. I had a lovely time there. I cured my madness for all time, no doubt, by having a dip. And it was a brilliant pilgrimage. It was a wonderful trip, and it did me no end of good. I was having a sort of struggling time with ill parents and lockdown and everything else. And it was just a beautiful retreat. But it has also salved and saved the island itself, because that holy status is great for the pilgrim, but it's also great for the island. And there's that kind of coincision there that, for me, gets to the heart of spirituality, when we and the land, we and the landscape, will have a common purpose and a common cause, when we are kind of finding ourselves to be, if you like, it's a common phrase, but at one with nature. There's lots of ways you can say that in a more complicated way, but I mean, that's basically it, isn't it? When you feel you're on a level with the natural world, and your fate and your kind of experience is there in harmony with that nature. So a place of worship in every sense, and it radiates out its goodness to me, but also to the landscape and the birds and the rest of the wildlife, the trees and so on, which live on this island. And it was this island fell into disuse for a very long period, and at the Reformation, the church, which had done so much to establish it as a place of pilgrimage, suddenly turned against it and was full of denunciations about how dreadful it was that anyone would dare go to this island, and how it was all popery and paganism and all that kind of stuff. So it was actually, we talk quite often about, secular age, and no, people aren't interested. In fact, it's quite often the church which has driven people away from these sorts of devotions, the kind of thing that Andrea's looking at developing again and reopening up, that I've looked at so often. You've got lots and lots of sacred natural places. This is a holy well in North Wales, which again, it's it's a ruin and it's been neglected, and it was the church when reforming that said, oh no, we're not having any more of this carrying on. So they would have destroyed this well chapel in Wales. Again, it's been sort of left in ruins. So the church has absented its voice to a large extent from some of these places, and some people still do. Some people question whether we should be going back to these places or not. And my view, and I don't know what you think, and we're going to have some question time at the end afterwards and so on, but my view really is it's a bit like sort of Halloween for me or something, which was as Christian as you can possibly get in conception and in its history. Halloween is All Hallows Eve. It's entirely wrapped around the Christian calendar, All Saints' Day, the following day. So you have a real popular folk following of this day, Halloween, and then the church suddenly walks away from it and then leaves it, having set it up and encouraged people for many centuries to do something on All Hallows Eve, then turns around and sort of starts tutting about it. So I do think, you know, at very least, as somebody of faith, it's quite helpful to own these places to some extent and to say, well, there is a legacy there, and it's, you know, this is part of our history and our heritage, and whether, you know, however you look at it, you still have to take ownership of it. It's not quite right just to sort of dismiss it without acknowledging the role of faith in building these places. For me, these are wonderful places, and so on. So it may be outside the formal church's orbit, but there's an awful lot of people who would consider that to be no bad thing, and there are people who are closer to the church who would also might find engaging constructively and creatively with that will bring them some kind of sense of continuity. And, you know, religion is all about continuity. So here I am speaking. I speak very freely and openly and enthusiastically about interacting with the natural world and what that means. And I think it's a very creative and fertile space where we can rediscover and also invent and create new connections to the land for us, and for people who sort of want to come along too. It's a kind of lots of community activities in local places. And you've seen this picture, so Andrea, this is the only slide that I overlap with Andrea, although I think I also know where that St. Bino's well is, Andrea. I think it's in the I think it's the Holy Well you showed us. I've been to about 3 St. Bino's wells, but I think that one's in the front garden by quite near a road going through. Yeah, I'm sure I know which one that is, as a Holy Well nerd. But here, yes, and it's the work that Andrea is doing with spiritual practice pilgrimages that rings a real, that really resonates with me, which is developing, and I commend it really wholeheartedly. And when we spoke, I was really keen to do anything I can to support it. And it's a point worth stressing again. I know we're stuck here on Zoom and it's pixels, and sorry about that and so on, but pilgrimage is very much an embodied, physical, real world, practical thing to do. It's an experience of faith in the here and now. And it's also free-ranging and free-spirited. So I know it's me wittering on here on Zoom, but really there are your own stories to tell and to make and to create and so on. And all the work I've ever done with my books. This is the big tome, which Andrea held up and so on. It's enormous. And the whole point is it's a guidebook. I didn't sit down and write, well, this is all my kind of stuff and you can't have it. You've got to read it through me. It's a guidebook, and there's postcodes so you can get out there and do and enjoy things yourselves. And that's important to me. So it's pilgrimage. And I would say that this whole idea of pilgrimage that's coming back again, and that is being invented and reinvented all the way through, is moving us almost back slightly to the original sense of the word pilgrimage and what pilgrimage is about anyway. It's a very rich, glorious legacy, as it says there on the screen. There are very few words in the English language, it's certainly in religious tradition, which tends to be quite resistant to change, but pilgrimage actually has changed radically since it first appeared as a concept in Christianity. To us now, the word pilgrimage probably means, although you might be ahead of me on this one because people are shifting, but pilgrimage certainly traditionally means going off somewhere and ending up at a cathedral, which has a nice tea room and gift shop and everything else, and you do all of that stuff. But a pilgrimage is going along a linear route that many people have trod before, to a specific holy destination. And obviously cathedrals are in the middle of cities. So the great cathedral routes of the Middle Ages were very much the kind of, I mean, even I think it's the M2 today follows the main walking route taken down to Canterbury. So they would constellate Britain by connecting up the great cities with their cathedrals. So that was pilgrimage in the high medieval period. But and there you can see the Canterbury Towers as they head down the M2 on their horses. But the word that actually the word pilgrimage comes from is peregrinatio in early medieval Latin. That's the only Latin you're going to get tonight, so don't worry. Peregrinatio, it's used a lot when you read about early medieval spirituality. Peregrinatio was a very common phrase, pilgrimage as we call it now. It didn't mean ever going from where you were to a specific holy destination and coming back home again. It actually means, the original word would mean something like wandering or traveling. So it wasn't linear. There is an older way of being a pilgrim, which is not going down a path, but it's more, if you like, rambling or roaming, a kind of a walk. Even a local walk could be a pilgrimage if you're going off just with no particular destination in mind, but just to go and encounter what you come across. It's very much a kind of narrative form of spirituality where you just make your stories as you go along. More along the lines of the local work Andrea's doing with and other people, of course, Sacred Spaces Kingston, kind of local, going out and doing things. The first pilgrims did literally almost anything you can do traveling apart from going to a specific holy place and then coming back home again. They went off and spent time wandering about on foot out of the town, out of the village, to find God in the outdoors, in the wilderness. The first pilgrims were exiles and wayfarers, aliens, strangers, and travelers, almost nomads, if you like. To be a pilgrim at the most extreme would be somebody cut off from home and mainstream society alike. They were people given quite often to contemplation, almost a form of hermit, people who develop their own personal devotions and their own spiritual practices. So there are lots and lots of stories of people doing their own kind of quirky interactions with the landscape. They would very much approve of the idea of making new landscape encounters and ending up on a beach, as Andrea's pilgrim route does, is exactly in the spirit of the original pilgrims, the wanderers, looking there and taking their journey out into the landscape. So in one early story, we've got a bit of a Columba theme today, because I know we're the Columba looms large over Andrea's story with her pilgrimage, but Columba looms large anyway over what we call kind of Celtic spirituality. And Columba himself uses the word, he talks at one point about a heron who's going to come to their monastery, and he asks the people in his monastery to come in to the monastery and to welcome it. And if you look at this quote here, so it's a little bit long, but Columba predicts the arrival of this heron, and he says in the third last line from the bottom, it will no longer want to stay as a pilgrim with us, for when its strength is recovered, it will return to the sweet district of Ireland. So Columba is referring to a bird that arrives as a pilgrim, as a wanderer, and so on. That's how much fellowship pilgrimage meant with the natural world. You could refer to the animals as well as pilgrims. Even by this stage, the idea of pilgrim is starting to shift to become the idea of a visitor and someone going to a specific place. In Columba's native Ireland, this condition of being a wanderer, of being a pilgrim, somebody cut off and traveling, was referred to as green martyrdom and white martyrdom. White martyrdom is mentioned in an early Columba text, and there's obviously red martyrdom, which means being killed and so on, but there's the green and the white martyrdom as well. Green martyrdom refers really to kind of putting yourself out in the natural world and being very exposed to the elements. One academic thinks it means green because you literally turn green with cold, and you're about to sort of die from being exposed to nature so much, which I've felt occasionally. I felt quite green actually when I was rowing across that island in the leaky boat, but I survived, so I'm not a martyr for that one. And white martyrdom meant that pain and yearning of being away from home, of being cut away, being on a kind of journey, exile from your homeland, which was actually in some ways Columba's own condition. So he would have felt this bird, this heron coming from Ireland, staying with him and going back, would be for him very wistful, because there he was, cut away from his own land for various reasons. So one of my favorite early kind of pilgrims, this is St. Aya, who gave us St. Ives in Cornwall, which you may know, on the north coast. And St. Aya is one of those very early first pilgrims who crossed the Irish Sea in a coracle, or a leaf, as it's referred to kind of poetically. So she would have travelled across the sea and was a nun and a church founder in North Cornwall. I think I've done some research on this, and I'd be delighted if anybody could put me right in the chat on this. I think St. Aya is the first female martyr of Britain, and possibly the first female British saint as well. So I think she ought to be kind of celebrated a bit more. I don't know of any others who are named before St. Aya. So she's given us St. Ives, which is a very lovely place to go, but also I think she's worth celebrating in her own right. She's another of those Irish pilgrims. You know, we're not all going to do men today, Andrea, don't worry. St. Aya. I think her story is definitely worth putting back on the map as well. I think you know, her kind of witness is pretty intense. I wouldn't cross the Irish Sea in that myself, but you know, that's the coracle. So there you go. There's a trip for you. Let's see if you can get insurance for that one. That might be pushing it, but there you go. There we have another pilgrim there in a leaf boat traveling across outside Ireland. And so this word pilgrim has shifted in meaning, and it's come to mean a steady move away from the idea that you encounter God just by randomly going out and bumping into what you bump into. The idea that it would be unregulated, free to roam and unbounded, it has become a more linear thing at the moment in kind of Christianity. And I think which is fine. I mean, words change their meaning, but I think there is one quite big problem with that, which is the idea that pilgrimage, in that sense of having to go to, I don't know, Santiago de Compostela, gives that immediate sense, or that essential idea that holy places are by definition somewhere else. So holy places you have to travel to get to. Holy places are far away, they're removed, they're distant, they involve a journey, which is fine. I mean, I've traveled to all the holy places in Britain, about 600 of them, and having got heartily sick to death of it for most of the driving along the roads and so on when I was doing this book, I'm slightly less enthusiastic about the journey than most people. But you can encounter the holy around you, in your back garden, in the local park. You can encounter it just by wandering, by going out into the woods and the wild, and we'll look at some ways that those practices can come around. There is a redemptive potential around us in our relationship to the natural world, in the middle of our home communities. The idea of holiness being somewhere else, actually this idea that the landscape and the land is holy and sacred where we live, I think is a really important one for us as we develop models that work when people today, you know, societies, communities want somewhere to cohere around. This is one of my favourite images of Llandifaelog in Wales, showing just how the church and the church enclave, the Llan, becomes kind of magnetic to the people. You can almost see it's like you put a magnet under a card with some iron filings on it. You can see how the landscape has warped its way, the community has warped itself around this Llan, this holy enclosure. And the word Llan, Welsh, doesn't mean a church. People assume it means the church of somebody. It's not. The clan actually is older than the church. It is that ring. It's that circular grove, that enclave in the landscape. And there's lots of evidence that they were pre-Christian configurations of holy space set apart. The church itself, the church building, comes later, but you have this idea of a reserve set apart in the natural world, which I think still appeals. And in some ways, that is the model for the first nature reserve, somewhere which is a kind of non-human space set apart from the farmland and the domestic and the factories and so on from exploitation. That is your place of contemplation, your place, God's acre, if you like. That's a place of where non-human values predominate, and it's not there to be exploited in traditional ways. So this idea of holiness being linked to the land, I think, is a very old one. And that idea of being a pilgrim, you could be a pilgrim, I would say, just wandering around your local churchyard like that, and encountering and contemplating what's gone on there before. So in holy places, what's been pinned to the landscape is part of the community identity. You know, people have come together and shared their hopes and their fears. So the idea of associating holy places with pilgrimage down a big road to somewhere far away, I think slightly runs the risk of overlooking this this kind of physical and mental map, the idea that you will find holiness there beneath your feet where you are. And I think that's it. It's you know, on the doorstep. As I say, I know Andrew and others do work locally. Sacred Spaces Kingston being one good example. I don't live very far away from Andrea, so I have no excuses not to eventually turn up. There was a winter solstice event which I couldn't make because my mum was coming back from a trip. But at some point, Andrea and I will as well. I'll join in your group, I'm sure. But holy places help us make emotional connections to land and to place. This, as you can see, these are the graves of the ancestors there, are in this churchyard. They're places to mourn and to remember, as well as places to inspire and celebrate. They're what helps stick us together. So we will look at what some of the kind of rituals and practices are and were in the church that made places like this special and holy and set apart. And we'll look at perhaps some of the, well, we will look at some of the rituals that were created around exactly these kind of configurations of land. And maybe if you're so moved on one of Andrea's pilgrimages, you will also throw yourself into the natural world in some of these ways. There's some very interesting kind of encounters to be had. So the first bit, I'd really like to talk about the really creative ways in which Christians, people of faith, would develop and interact with the landscape and the natural world. If you look at the lives of the early saints, someone like St. Columba, we're talking about him a lot tonight, and all the others as well in the early church, pages and pages of their lives, the hagiographies, talk about their interactions with the natural world. And you sometimes wonder, do you actually have any time to talk to any of the people as well while you're busy going off and doing stuff? Because it's really predominates how much energy and focus they directed towards nature, and at least as much they did speaking to people themselves. And that's a kind of faith that I quite like, really. I think rather than wagging your fingers at the local people telling them to get into church, will be to actually go out and just interact and have all these wonderful encounters. Some of the rituals that we will look at are actually really would be quite surprising to a modern Christian and might sound on the surface to be more pagan than Christian, some of the things that went on. And I did, as Andrea says, I did a PhD on these Celtic nature rituals to try and work out why they were going into nature, why they were so intensively interacting. And I have to say that only by actually going and getting out from the library where I was doing my research and going to these places and doing what the saints did I really understand what was going on in order to see the full insight that actually there was quite a lot of very important stuff going on. So let us start. Here we go. Here's one of the very important things the early saints did. And you can do this. You can take bag of mealworms. There you go, Andrea, you can deal with that. Go through your airport security with your bag of mealworms. It was feeding the animals. So an awful lot of the early saints would go out, and they would have food with them, and they would feed them. St. Cuthbert was brought a salmon by an eagle once, and he insisted that they cut the salmon in half and gave some to an eagle. Lots of other stories as well about saints. They give bread. It's usually bread that they offer, actually, rather than a salmon, including even committed carnivores such as wolves would come in and would take bread from the hermit's hands and be tame and eat them. So hermits were often seen as giving up part of their food. That was just a very important part of their holiness, was their willingness to share food with wild animals. So if you've got a bird feeder at home, you're well on your way to sanctity and sainthood, in my book anyway. And a second activity, and you'll know this one from St. Francis, would be preaching to the birds. Most famous with St. Francis talking to them, but there's numerous other stories of British and Irish saints talking to the animals. St. Cuthbert on Innerfarn Island preached to the birds as well. And we've heard about St. Columba and the heron already, which he welcomed in as a guest. So there was this offering hospitality, feeding and housing a pilgrim heron into the monastery. So that's another way to kind of connect. As I say, this kind of spirituality, it's fine, it's good for us. Great, go out and have a good thing. But for me, to make it really meaningful, it has to be a two-way thing. So I tend to go out, as I say, and feed animals. They don't deserve me preaching at them, so I don't punish them with that. But I do go out and I take food. And another thing I take with me is a plastic bag, which I fill with rubbish when I go off to wild places and so on. So I bring some of the junk back. And it's amazing what you find, actually, if you're stopping and contemplating somewhere. There's a lot of rubbish in the landscape, unfortunately. So for me, it's a two-way thing. It should benefit us, but also the environment. And there's another set of rituals. This is something that I did most of my PhD on, in the end, was the bathing rituals of the early saints. Water rituals were enormously important in Celtic spirituality, and I focused on this very closely. And in the stories of Britain, there are around 40 descriptions of holy men and women who would strip off and wade into the sea in order to pray and sing their psalms. Some saints would even break the ice. St. Ethelfleda of Romsey Abbey would go in naked every single day of the year to the River Test, and she'd break the ice. And one time the Queen was watching from sneaked out of the monastery to watch this famous devotion, and the Queen got a cold just by watching her, nearly died, simply from watching from the riverbank. So they would really push themselves very far into the water. And there's a medieval depiction from the late 12th century of St. Cuthbert at a place called Coldingham, where he went and waded into the sea. And I found out where this place was, and I went and did it myself in 2018 when I was researching for my book, The Naked Hermit, to go and see what it was all about. And I'd read about this thing of going into the sea and saying psalms to the sound of the waves. And all historians really dismiss it as kind of implausible. They kind of say, no, no one would ever do that. It's too cold, and no one would ever go into the sea to actually pray. It's all nonsense. And I just thought, well, it keeps cropping up, and they talk about people, they name people who've seen it happen. So it's really very accurately documented. On the day I went to Coldingham, it was a calm sea, but I went another time, and it occurred to me then that the whole idea of saying, they said their psalms to the sound of the waves, this phrase appears. And it only occurred to me after actually doing this, that what they would do is they would say a line of the psalms, and then a wave would break and crash. And then they would say another line of the psalms. I don't know if in church you've done the antiphons, they call it, where one side says part of the psalm and the other side says the other bit. I think what they did was sort of almost perform a duet with nature. It was kind of a harmony with the natural world. And I've looked at it, and I'm pretty sure that was what was going on. They would talk about, they would actually go and worship, not merely with the nature as a backdrop, but the nature became an active participant in their rituals. And you could do this on dry land if you so wish. And the reason why I think nature was an active participant as well is, if you look at the illustrated manuscript on the left, you can see 3 little otters who came out and dried St. Cuthbert's feet after his bathing. And I think that is talking of the same thing, that Cuthbert himself and the natural world were at one in worshipping God, and there was a real kind of harmony there. When I sort of started looking at this, it felt quite marginal, to say the least, to Christianity, but it's very authentic, and it's very raw, and it's very stripped back. And I actually was asked by the BBC 2 did a program about kind of outdoor spirituality called Stories of Us a couple of years ago. And they actually asked me to go out and recreate this bathing ritual, which I did. And we went out for and did quite a long film about it. And it was great because I talked about the damage we've done to the environment, the damage we've done to ourselves and our self-image. And then we filmed it going into the lake. And I said to them, well, I would normally go with nothing on, because that was the way they would do it. Obviously, they didn't have Speedos. And the BBC went, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, go with nothing on. And they said, we have to check with the National Trust, because they've got a no nudity clause in their filming contract. So they phoned the National Trust up. National Trust said, yeah, no, that's great. We love it. Go for it. So they put this program out at 2 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. Didn't blur it or anything with me walking naked into the lake. And I thought, well, all right, this is what I do believe in, and it's authentic. And I got loads and loads of positive comments, and not a single negative comment back, because I thought people would kind of go, oh, you can't do that, that's all ridiculous, carry on. And my church, the next Sunday I went in, and everyone was just said, we love that, said you should take us down to the River Wandle in Wimbledon and do some more of that. So I was quite surprised how much people thought that was a sort of fun, positive thing. And I think this being kind of constrained by shame and fear and everything else, and a sort of sense of inhibition about the natural world, I actually think just embracing it in all honesty and simplicity is a perfectly fine thing to do. This is very much a hermit devotion, of course. This is me on my own, miles from anywhere. But it was a real sense of being really heavily exposed to the natural world. A similar thing, slightly less eye-catching because you can't really film it as well, but a similar kind of experience when I went into some of the hermit caves. And this is St. Columba's cave in Scotland, where I went, and I spent the night in some of these hermit caves. And they were known as being kind of demonic and haunted. And then the Celtic saints would go in, rather like the sea was seen as a place of great danger. So were these caves in the landscape, and the Celtic missionaries would go in and would spend the night in these caves. So I went and spent the night in several of these kind of really remote caves, and saw what it was like. It's actually really horrible, is what I can say. You know, never mind cold water or anything. It was really spooky and dank and frightening, and quite unpleasant in some ways to be there sleeping in this kind of gloomy cavern and wondering what animals were around. And it only occurred to me, having done it a lot, that was the whole point, is that the missionaries went in to the dark and contested places of the landscape and emerged intact the next day. So they came out and they would kind of demonstrate almost Christ emerging from the tomb, that our one God would keep them safe. Another ritual we have that the early church leaders, men and women, would do is they would also go so far as reconciling with the natural world, is they would make friends with, and they would have animals that they would follow them around. There's often stories of the hermit and the hunter. You might know of St Melangeth in sort of North Wales, just below Snowdonia. and St. Melangeth protected the hares of the valley from the hunters. She befriended them. And St. Cuthbert, even more extreme, actually performed a formal pardon and indulgence on the ravens who'd been stealing his crops. He forgave them and pardoned them. And so he sort of literally conducted a ritual of reconciliation with nature. And I have to say, you know, when we have such a damaged relationship with the natural world now, actually going out and kind of trying to make amends. As I say, don't forget your black plastic bag when you go on a pilgrimage. Put some rubbish in it and just make amends for the damage that me certainly has done to the natural world. And I think I'm going to be showing you my last ritual place landscape interaction that's of these kind of Celtic themes. This is the sacred tree. I showed you the grove at Llandifaelog, the Llan, the circular enclave. The tree has a really, really important part in Celtic spirituality. This is a tree in Surrey. I preached there a few years ago about sacred trees, no less, and they've got one in their churchyard, so that was rather handy. And they invited me in to talk about the role of sacred trees, which was great. And these trees crop up again all over the stories of the early saints. That frequently they would come and plant their staff in the ground, and it would miraculously spring up into a venerable yew tree or oak tree. And if you look sort of beyond those kind of rather fanciful stories, it's obvious that the sacred trees, and they're mentioned occasionally in the text, were places where people would hold synods and meetings and gatherings, and also intertribal meetings. So you would meet in a grove or by a sacred tree in order to have negotiations, often about peace. This predates Christianity. This idea of a kind of enclave in nature where you could meet is a very old configuration in the landscape. The kind of shadow of the sacred tree would be a place for negotiation, not by hitting each other with swords and sticks, but rather by sitting down to talk. So they were negotiated, again, non-human spaces in the landscape. The sacred tree had a very, very powerful resonance as that place. The earliest description of a church in all British writing, as far as I can tell, is from the sort of late 5th century, and it basically describes a building made out of branches in the middle of a field. So it's not just fanciful. There are configurations based around trees where people would meet. So the tree is a place of meeting, tree is a place of gathering and coming together and speaking to one another rather than hitting each other. The sacred grove is really a big thing. And it was very important in paganism too. There's lots of stories of pagan trees. And this is one curiosity I discovered. If you look at the stories of Britain and Ireland, all the sacred trees are kind of somehow absorbed into Christian tradition. The saint planted their staff, or the saint would preach beneath its branches, whatever. If you go to continental Europe, these sacred trees also appear, but frequently, numerous incidences, the missionary would actually take an axe and chop down the sacred tree rather than adopt it. So they would cut it down in order to defile it. St. Martin, the famous St. Martin of Tours monastic leader and bishop, chopped down a pine tree in the late Roman period in order to kind of show the local people that their God was not able to protect their sacred tree. So it was the case that in continental Europe, the trees generally were cut down, the groves were cut down, and in Celtic lands they were kept. And it's probably, the reason for that is probably quite prosaic, which is that in continental Europe, the missionaries had the empire behind them. So you could go and do things like impose the faith by chopping things down and telling people to go to do other things. You had the idea of an imperial rule. In tribal Britain, there was no such authority. If you turned up somewhere, you couldn't tell somebody to chop down their tree. There was no real imperial army or infrastructure left in Britain and Ireland. Well, Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. So it had to be a negotiation. And so the missionaries in Celtic lands had to take a more kind of left field approach, if you like, and work with the landscape and with the trees. That's one theory, which quite a lot of historians sort of think might be true. So there are ways as a Christian you can do the chopping down of the tree. That's one approach of being a person of faith. Or you can do the absorbing and the valuing and kind of re-protecting it and re-gracing it with a sense of the sacred and the holy. You can guess which one I kind of lean towards. And one thing I found is this chap became a good friend of mine doing my TV series. He's the chief druid, or was the chief druid in Britain, leader of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, Philip Cargom, and we met together at this henge site in Dorset, and you can just see there's remnants of a grove of yew trees. There's only 2 trees left at the back there, which once ringed this site. So it was once a grove site, and then the Christians came and put their church in the middle of this sacred grove, and now both have fallen into disuse. But you can see that there is this kind of overlap, where people would Christians would come and find very gainful and fruitful resonance in the landscape, and they would actually adopt it as it was. You know, they wouldn't build the church elsewhere and cut down the trees. They adopted that grove. There's not many of them, but that's one which really speaks volumes of the whole idea that you could come and worship in that pre-Christian space, that pre-Christian landscape. So, and I'll explain how all of these kind of weird things like wading into the sea and preaching to the birds and so on, how it does actually have a place, a really valid place in Christian tradition and narrative. And it's quite easy, really. The first of these is the gathering here, like this church there. And it was that, this, as I said, the hermits and the saints and the pilgrims feeding bread to animals. It's very obvious, really. It's a Eucharistic image. They were seeing the shapes of the Eucharist themselves, shaped that. The second of those rituals that they performed, preaching to birds, is obviously another very easy one. You can see where that comes from in Christian tradition. Exhorting and passing on morality stories to animals is obviously what we do in church anyway. So it's another part of mainstream practice, sharing bread, preaching. The bathing rituals that I looked at, and as I say, that was most of my PhD, I looked at them very closely because I was thinking, what on earth were they doing? Why were they going into water to do this? What was so full on? And it was sort of fallen into abeyance for sure as a Christian tradition, but it was really common. And by looking at the words they used to describe it, it became clear that it was modeled directly on baptism. So they'd use the same words to describe baptism as they would to talk about this bathing thing. The saints would emerge as pure as when they emerged from their own mother's womb, would be one phrase from one of the saints who would take a nightly bathing in cold outdoor water. And that's language from the baptismal liturgy of the day. So every day they were going and recreating their baptism, doing it in the landscape. Another one with the caves, going into the haunted caves, which I did, as I say, and had some pretty horrible nights doing that, and confronting spiritually dangerous and contested places in the landscape. Often they would also go, as I say, into the sea when there was a storm, and they would make the sign of a cross and cast oil sometimes on the water to bless the water, to calm the storm. And there, obviously, that was modeled very much on exorcism, driving out the demons of the landscape. So that's another thing which might sound quite pagan and quite kind of folklory, but actually it was a thoroughly Christian ritual that shaped it, going out and driving out, or not even driving out, but making friends with, making peace with the demons, the devils on the land. And finally, we have those sacred trees, which I talked about, which are the meeting places, bringing communities together. Ancient sites where people used to meet and where the churches were built alongside. This is another of my favorite ones, an ancient yew tree, far older than the church, and yet there's that church built alongside it. Again, the place where people meet and gather. The name in Ireland, there's 3 great monastic foundations There's Derry, which is where Andrew's pilgrimage takes in, very much so. There's also Kildare, and those two names have the word der in, which is the Irish for oak, and that's not a coincidence. Derry means field of the oak, Kildare means church of the oak, and Columba built another monastery at Durrow, which means the plain of the oak tree. So the oak trees were completely the place of monastic foundation. They were all of three of those most important Irish churches were actually oak tree places first, and then, because obviously you can't grow an oak in a few months, you've got to, the oak's got to be established. So they built their churches and monasteries, St Columba, at the places famous for the oak trees. So what I wanted to show you with all of these wonderful places in the landscape is that there is resonance with a more kind of what we consider formal Christian ritual. And I just would encourage breaking that down a lot, the idea that you could have baptism, Eucharist, exorcism, reconciliation, preaching, church foundation, a lot of time spent in prayer. The whole natural world is the church for the Celtic, in that Celtic viewpoint. And the kind of final point I'll end on is really that Celtic pilgrimage is very different, as I said at the start, to this kind of pilgrimage that we think of it now. Nowadays, you go into your local church for your baptism, Eucharist, exorcism. Well, I don't know how often you get exorcised, but certainly putting on the oil and blessing and healing, reconciliation and preaching and meeting people. We go into the church to do that. So it's kind of like holiness is found in the church, whereas in this early Celtic spirituality, the trajectory is the exact opposite direction. Is you would take all of those rituals, which we think of as being confined to the church, and they would almost bleed out into the landscape. The trajectory is the other way. They would go out, radiating out, almost like casting rays of light. The whole sacramentality of Christianity was considered so powerful, it couldn't help but bleed out from the church to touch and infuse the world around. And I think that sense of wonder and amazement, there's Durrow there, the oak trees, is something that I really would capture and encourage again. There are rituals where Rogation Tide, where churches go out as communities and walk around the local place and carry that there. So I'm going to end. These are some of the monastic islands where I've gone, and I've spent nights in prayer and solitude, and I felt there as very much as sacred as you'll feel in any church. And the last point I'll make, I talk about reconciliation and exorcism. All of these holy places in the landscape will attract darkness, the demons that need to be exorcised. These were places that were ransacked by the Vikings. Holy places are places where you bring and experience your most extreme emotions. So nearly all holy places have been conflicted, and we've seen enough ruins already on my little run through places where people have fought about, have argued over, people have been killed and martyred and so on. Holy places also have that kind of ability to hold the dark and the light together. So when you do go, bring all those thoughts with you, obviously your hopes, but also your fears, your joys, but also your troubles. They are places where those two find their conciliation. That is it. In the landscape is where you find the kind of nemesis for violence, where you will find peace. And I will stop there. It's exactly 45 minutes. Yes, it is, to the minute. Thank you, Andrea. I said 45 minutes, and I will shut up and let other people say their bit.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Would you mind stop sharing screen?
That will happen immediately.